Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brandon Hamber. I'm the John Hume and Tip O'Neill Chair in Peace at Ulster University. And I'd firstly just like to welcome everybody here today and thank you for taking the time to be with us. We have an audience in the room. We also are live streaming this. There's over 100 people who are tuning in, so welcome to all of those who are also not in the room. We're here today to launch the book Localising Memory in Transitional Justice with the subtitle The Dynamics and Informal Practices of Memorialisation After Mass Violence and Dictatorship. And it's an event hosted by the Transitional Justice Institute, Healing Through Remembering, and NCOR, all based, well, other than Healing Through Remembering, based here at the university. So you're all welcome to be with us this afternoon. The book itself is edited by Stephan Parmentier from the Faculty of Law and Criminology at KU Leuven, along with his colleague Mina Rauschenbach, Julia Viebach from the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. So they're the editors of the book. What we're going to do this afternoon is hear a little bit from the editors as a way of sort of formally launching the book. And then we're going to host a panel discussion to talk about some of the themes that are in the book. And I'll introduce our panel when we start with that. But for now, I would like to just welcome Stephan, who's had a busy day getting here today from Belgium, arrived a few minutes ago after a very delayed flight. So take a breath, and you're very welcome, and we look forward to the introduction. So thanks, Stephan.
Thank you so much, Brandon and dear colleagues. I have just taken a deep breath and arrived 5 minutes before the start of the meeting, so perfect timing. Thank you so much for having us, for inviting us here at the Institute. It's a great opportunity for us to be here and to discuss the main themes of the book, because the book is, of course, about memory in a localizing context. And we'll try to explain later on what that exactly means. It's been a while since I was last in Belfast, I think before the Good Friday agreements even, as an observer to a trial and commissioned by Amnesty International in the so-called Diplock courts. You may remember what they were, the single judges sitting on so-called terrorist cases. And Amnesty, together with many other organizations, were very concerned about the evidence gathering and the rules of procedure. So another great opportunity to meet you here today in Belfast. Please allow me just a couple of words to explain how the book came about. I think the very first talks took place in 2016, as I remember that Mina and Julia at the European Society of Criminology conference in Münster at the time in Germany were discussing the possibility of doing something on memory and doing something from a localized or localizing perspective. And we followed suit because in 2017 we had two seminars with the idea to develop the concept further. The first one actually took place in Rome in April of that year in the beautiful setting of the Accademia Belgica. I can highly recommend it for those who would like to visit. And the second took place later on that year in October at the University of Leuven, where we had a more extensive panel, of which also Stephanie was part. So we were very pleased to gradually develop the idea, and 18 and 19 were the years, in fact, where the chapters were written. Then COVID struck, and of course, you know, the world is always to be divided in a before and an after. So it took us a little bit of extra time to finish the book, but we're very happy that it has finally materialized. And so this is the cover. We have some flyers just in case you would want to have a closer look. In the Rome seminar, we actually focused on the issue or the topic of the duty to remember, because that, at that time, already 6 years ago, was a very hot topic. It was about the idea that nations, that states, that communities should remember a number of atrocities committed in the past. And actually, there was a legislative move and movement to install and incorporate in law a number of those developments in various countries. In Europe, definitely, but also in other parts of the world. Even to the effect of also installing and setting up memory institutes in some country. Remember the Polish Institute, the Czech Institute in Central Europe. At the same time, well, a little bit later, in 2020, the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations, with the long title and abbreviated as the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, called for the recognition of memory as an additional pillar of transitional justice. So next to criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, victim reparation programs, and guarantees of non-repetition, that memory would be recognized as a separate, a so-called fifth pillar of transitional justice. And that actually provided a sort of an avalanche to focus even more attention to the topic. On the other hand, in the course of our discussions and brainstorming at the seminars mentioned and also later on, we came to the conclusion that memory, of course, is not only about commemorating the past. It's often possible that memory also generates new conflict, because the memory of one group, of one person, may be very different from the memory of another person. And the way to remember may be very different for various groups and various entities. So you see, and actually you have in the book a couple of examples where this can be portrayed. Moreover, memory is not a singular concept. It is actually a plural one. So we started to think about memories in plural, because there are so many divergences and so many possibilities to remember. But still, we came to the conclusion that a lot of memory building and a lot of memory construction is done in a top-down way. Through national institutions, through regional communities, through government settings in the first place. And we wanted to shift the paradigm in the sense of focusing and understanding how local events and how local initiatives for memory and memory building took root or have taken root. So this idea of a bottom-up perspective, this idea of memory building from below, was very much at the heart of this book. Also the possibilities, of course, of contrasting memories as a result. And so this permeates the book, these ideas in the background. And of course, we have a couple of particular focuses in the book, which I hope Mina will further elucidate. And of course, Julia will also echo in the course of the panel discussion. So thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to a great discussion.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having invited us. It's really a pleasure to be here in Belfast to discuss the book, but also to understand better the resonances with the local contexts here and also elsewhere, with the Liberian case as well. Maybe just a few words to contextualize, building up on what Stephan said. With this book, we kind of built up on research that was focused on the local, but also on the non-judicial forms of transitional justice. And what we observed was that these were often, at that point, case study based, when there were studies on these topics. And so we thought, okay, we need to get into a more nuanced, a more in-depth understanding of localizing memory, and I will explain a bit more why it's localizing. Focusing on informal and localized memory practices in different contexts. And this is everyday processes of memory work. I see here everyday objects transformed by the conflict. It's this idea of these everyday bottom-up processes. that can be symbols, that can be performances, art initiatives. So you have many different of these forms that are reflected in this book. And these are practices of nuanced and complex justice claims, justice experiences, practices of different informal mnemonic communities. And the book really represents this complexity and these very different actors that are involved in this memory work. Now, we also wanted to draw on the critical transitional justice scholarship that was calling for TJ from below, looking at the relationship between memory, TJ, and the local, thinking about these intersections, about these frictions, about these contradictions, about all these different interdependencies, and looking at different levels. So it's the local, but it's not only the local, and it's beyond a comparison between the local and other levels. It goes really beyond also this idea of a binary understanding also of these processes, and processes of very often there's sometimes the idea that the local is maybe better than maybe more broader forms of justice. So here the idea is to go beyond this idea of romanticizing the local and thinking about the power hierarchies, the imbalances. So why localizing? Localizing is about a dynamic related to the local. So it's memory practices that are happening locally, but also how these practices can relate to other practices, other processes, more broader politics of memory, also global and universalist discourses, and basically how these different initiatives can relate to each other, can counter each other, can balance each other. How do these different levels function? And the focus is on space, spatiality, in memorialization, looking at places of remembering and the materiality of these forms of memory. And these different forms are very much also dependent on the nature of the conflict and the socio-political realities. And we have very different socio-political realities that are represented in this book. It's a broader conception of place here that we wanted to delve into. So it's about virtual place, it's about artifacts, it's about symbolic locations, sites of conflict. And the bidirectional relationship that exists between space and memory was very much a focus. Again, in this idea of dynamics, in this idea of localizing. So how does space construct or articulate identity, stimulate remembering, but also how practices of remembering can transform, reappropriate, or reconstruct space. And dynamics, lastly, is also about the social interactions that are behind these practices. You have many different actors that are involved in these practices with power relationships and memory entrepreneurs and different mnemonic communities. Collective memories that we highlight, or the different, I would say, dynamics between collective memories are highlighted at different levels of analysis. You have the national level, you have the civil society organization levels, the victim organizations, which are very important, but also international organizations. And we're looking at the different strategies of actions of these communities, their repertoires. There can be ritual, commemorative practices around commemorative sites. It can be more about defacement, removal. A lot of different examples that are in this book. And it's going to be also very interesting, I think, to hear from our discussants about their take on these different repertoires of action and these mnemonic communities. There are different mediation channels that are analyzed here at different interests and agendas. As I said, it's about power, it's about memory entrepreneurs, and these different interests and agendas depend very much on the position in the transitional justice matrix, power matrix, the socio-political context, but also the opportunities. And these opportunities can be local, national, global. And finally, we're talking about collective memories, but there are also individual memories. So how do these intersect? How do these sometimes contradict each other? And how do sometimes collective memories maybe dominate the mnemonic space? And individual memories, how are they able to be maintained and to be expressed? And very finally, we also looked into this transformative nature of collective memory practices, with some chapters which look at how these processes are fluid, can transform with time, can be reappropriated. Discourses can be resignified, reappropriated. There can be eruptions of memory. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of you and to having a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Stephan, Mina, for giving us an outline of the book, and also to Julia as the editors for supporting this process and putting forward what's a really interesting book with really detailed and deep case studies in it. And our hope for this afternoon over the next hour will really be to dig down a little bit into some of those themes that Mina mentioned and hear from a panel, some who have been part of the authors of the book, including myself, and then others who are working here from different contexts. So I'm going to introduce, before we start, our panel, and then I'm going to ask the panel to open up. I'll ask an initial question. Maybe for about 30 minutes, I'll talk with yourselves, and then we'll open up to the floor. And all being well, I can be able to take a couple of questions on the iPad from those who are watching us online as well. So I'm going to start on our far end over there, and this is Claire Hackett, who is from the Falls Community Council and runs a project called the Dúchas Archive and Conflict Resolution Team. And Claire is also a board member of Healing Through Remembering, who's one of the supporters of the event today. So you're very welcome, Claire. In some senses, you're having to represent the local voice, so don't feel that that's too heavy a burden in a complex place like here, but thanks very much for joining us. Next to Claire is Stephanie Schwandner-Sievers, who is from the School of Health and Social Care at the University of Bournemouth. And Stephanie has written one of the chapters in the book as an anthropologist, and the chapter focuses on Kosovo. So we'll hear from Stephanie. And then Julia Viebach, who is from the University of Bristol and is also one of the editors of the book and wrote a chapter on Rwanda, if I remember correctly. And so we'll hear a bit from Julia. And then finally, Aaron Weah, who is a PhD researcher here at the Transitional Justice Unit at Ulster University. And Aaron's research is focusing on local memory in the Liberian context. So we thought that would give a nice another focus on our discussions. So that's our panel for this afternoon. As I said, we go for about half an hour, and then we maybe take a couple of questions. Mina mentioned it. Behind you there is a poster for the everyday objects of the conflict, and that's an exhibition which is actually downstairs here at the university from Healing Through Remembering, who we partner with. A really interesting exhibition where people give us objects that for them represent the conflict. And they can be really varied, from someone who donates a punk record and says, this is how I remember the 1970s in Belfast, through to somebody who has donated coins which, when the bomb went off, were lodged in their body to help tell their story. So there are a whole range of different objects. But I think, as Mina mentioned, it sort of starts to touch on this very local, personal way of talking about memory and the conflict. So in some ways it's a nice place to start, and links to the first question I would like to ask you all, and you don't have to answer in any particular order, but the book is called Localising Memory, and I know some of you tackle that in the work itself, but when you hear that phrase, localising memory, what does it mean to you and to your research? So what does that phrase mean? Maybe you use another phrase. I'm not sure, but anyone like to open up with a comment on localising memory?
Sure.
Stephanie.
Happy to go. For anthropology, of course, the local is the focus of what we do. But what is the local? It's a huge question. It's also very ambiguous. I tend to define it or to understand it through a very classic sociological focus, George Simmel's idea of the stranger. 1908, famous article of the stranger, and the local is all what the stranger is not. So the local is the person who does not go necessarily tomorrow, or who stays. And it's always, you have in social interactions, in social beingness dwelling, to use Heidegger's terminology, you have a negotiation of proximity and distance, and the local is where you have an engagement with a shared way of meaning making through objects, through places, as a group. So the people you interact with have this engagement that they share, which are meaningful. So, for example, when we talk about enspaced memory, which is very phenomenological cases and spaced memory, we think about, when you walk through your streets and you remember, oh, that's where I went to school, this is where my children went to school, and this is where my grandchild goes to school, for example, then there's a whole embeddedness and spaceness and embeddedness which links you socially to space. And that is different from the person who comes and goes and has no investment locally. So it's of course a problematic term, because you can never fix, of course, the local person might then also migrate and still have the sense of home. But it is, from an anthropological point of view, I would suggest it's about where meaning is socially shared. That's the local people. And then, of course, that becomes really relevant if you experienced as a group being persecuted for your group characteristics. In Albania, that would be that you experienced that as Albanians, you were the people who were massacred. So then you develop the sense of identity, which is national, but ethno-national, but also which is responsive and which is also located in the space. So you're the local in terms of meaning in relation to a space and social interconnectivity, I would suggest.
So the meaning making and the space is the really important part.
I would suggest so.
Yeah.
But it's problematic, because in international relations or political sciences, you might think of the local as being the local council or the local municipality. So you would be talking about forms of representation, whereas for anthropologists, the local is not necessarily institutionalized. Mm-hmm. It can be very subjective. It's about meaning to anyone. It can be very private, but I think the shared experience is important, and the shared meaning making.
It's an excellent way of framing the discussion for us. Okay. When you were speaking, I was thinking we ran a focus group here on a project a couple of years ago up on a very well-known road in Belfast called the Shankill Road, And we'd advertised people to come to this meeting from the Shankill. And there was a person in the audience who, when he introduced himself, he now lives in a nice middle-class neighborhood, 10 miles away. And he said, but I'm from here. So we said, where are you from? And he said, I live over here. And then I was like, okay, that's strange, because we'd advertised that. And he said, no, but I'm from here. Even though he maybe hadn't been there for a very long time, but when he saw that advert, he was from there. So anyone else want to add?
Yeah. In the Liberian context, from my work, I think the local is more shaped by the nature of the violence. The notion of the local in Liberia is pretty much linked to the nature of the violence and how it has shaped the different sites of memory. Some of these sites of memory are visible, while some are invisible. Unlike in some parts of Latin America, where the violence there what took on the form of organized disappearance, in Liberia, the violence, as well as in Exodus, Sierra Leone, was pretty much in the open, was public. But how this violence took place, it didn't happen in people's homes. People were internally displaced. There were executions in different places. So eventually, at the end of the conflict, sites of massacres contained people who were not originally from the community where this happened. And culturally, that has impacted how people are responding to these different sites, to these different sites of memory. In one of the cases I'm looking at, that there has emerged a major argument over how to proceed. There's now still made over one of the different sites of memory. 25% of those killed there were local to the community, are known to the community, whereas 80% of those killed there are unknown. Where did these people come from? Some other part of the country, there are rumors that your loved ones were killed over there, but because there is no proof of my loved ones being killed there, the marginal error is quite very wide. So it has become problematic. How do the 80% proceed with memory work in an area where there's an estimated amount of how many persons were killed here? So here in the Liberian cultural and traditional context is that some people, some community have used this invisible part of memory making more on the spiritual side. People rely on dreams and interpretations. People have used these dreams to order the way they engage with it, which raises an important question when I look back at localizing memory and memory and in terms of materiality. How do we grapple with memory in the form of in a spiritual form, where people rely on spiritual communication, to deal with some of these invisible places, because you see a pattern of memory making is emerging, especially to those who do not recognize, who do not know, who do not have proof of where their loved ones were buried, and now they have to turn to a more spiritual form of interpretation, to lead there. So I just wanted to make the point that the local in this context is shaped mostly by the memberscape of the visible and the invisible dimensions, of memory making in Liberia.
So that's really interesting, because it doesn't challenge, but it adds to that sort of idea of place-based. You use place-based proximity, I think,
yes,
in your
exactly,
chapter,
yes.
And so it sort of adds this other level of what do we mean by place, because it could be like an imagined spiritual place.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily
Absolutely.
always a physical place. Did you want to add to that, Julia? Because I know you used that phrase.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found it both interesting and fascinating what Stephanie and Aaron were saying, and I think really the localizing is about place-based and a specific standpoint. And obviously, as editors, we haven't come up with this idea localizing, but it's actually taken from Waldorf and Shaw's work on localizing transitional justice. So I think it's just important to reference that here as well. But I think, as you both said, it's the proximity, it's the place, and the meaning making. And I see memory sort of connecting those three aspects throughout. And the place can be invisible, and that it is actually communicating communicating with the cosmological world, right, and the ancestor and the spirits. But what I found in my work, and also which is known from places like Uganda, where you also had a lot of internal displacement, and I think perhaps there's a bit of similarity here, that this means that you can't, or it's very difficult to actually communicate to the spiritual world in the absence of that place, right? The invisibility of it. And in the case of Rwanda, so I wrote a chapter on basically meaning making of survivors working at memorials in Rwanda. That for them it is extremely important to have this proximity to the dead at that particular site where they know the remains of their loved ones are buried, or where they have died, where they think they might be buried. Because as well, again, we have a problem, obviously, of identification of victims. I mean, you had in the case of Bosnia in particular a lot of work on the DNA identification in the mass graves. That I don't know how Liberia worked. I assume that wasn't much done there either. So in Rwanda as well, you have a problem of actually locating and knowing where your loved ones are, and this not knowing is extremely difficult because it puts people in a liminal phase. So meaning making becomes much more difficult when you don't have this place to go to as a site of commemoration and mourning, really. So I think memory has a lot to do with mourning as well. Yeah.
I'm going to just react quickly.
Yeah, and then I'll maybe come to you, Claire, if you want to.
Yeah, on the identification of mass grave, so Guatemala has been using this forensic anthropology method. Yeah. It has come up. There's been a conversation about how effective would that be because one of the studies on forensic anthropology is that it can be faulty in a context where there are polygamous relationships. The DNA, the identification through DNA becomes problematic. It is not as accurate as it would be in a monogamous arrangement. So it has come up, and so the utility of it in such an environment, so you could easily make a lot of, it might be more accurate in a monogamous context, whereas in a polygamous arrangement where DNA patterns and arrangement are much more easily confused, it may serve. So that's a conversation that is still on the way, still being discussed, but it hasn't fully been resolved. So we are not there yet with the identification of mass grave through that medium. Yeah.
So an interesting complexity to add to the discussion. Claire, I introduced you as the local person, so that's, I don't know if that's good or bad or problematic.
Complete compliment, thank you. First of all, I thought it was a great title for the book. I want to say that because it made me, just the title alone made me think. So how I immediately responded to it was, I suppose as a community activist myself, and thinking this is about, claiming community, local, grassroots. And as I, dipped into the book and read the case studies, and I found that was the case. But the other way that I responded to it was almost like a call to localise memory, to actually make a claim that memory needs to be localised, how to localise memory. And what you said, Stephanie, made me think of, in my own archive work, which is, community-based archive, and we work with many different communities and different community interviewers. But all interviews start off with where and when you were born. So that's a kind of a thing that localises the story straight away, because the where you were born, and that has proved to be very rich in terms of developing points of contact and spaces for dialogue and conversation across great difference. But then, listening to what you're saying, Aaron, as well, is making me think just back to that call for localising, and the need for memory to be tethered in some way, and what is not, that the great problems that are being experienced in Liberia around not having that anchor for memory. It just makes you realise what needs to be done. And I suppose that's another way in which I respond to a lot of the things, a lot of the case studies that I was reading about that intersection with justice, how, local memories and local communities, doing this memory work in order to call for something wider to happen. And it made me think also of how local memories can change according to how political context change, or how, if there is some more official processes or top-down processes that are actually working, you know, local memories make a call on those and call for those, but if they're actually really there, then local memories can respond to that. It's something about a dynamic being needed in that. I suppose that's very present for me at the moment as well, because we have a situation here where, you know, a lot of truth recovery work is being closed down through, you know, the Act of Parliament, going through Parliament at the moment around the Legacy Bill. And so I thought of all the context you were talking about, you know, attempts to close down memory, and then how that makes it more difficult for local people to actually more freely express their memories. There's something that, you know, they're reduced to making a campaign, and, you know, that being the whole focus of it, and not having the space for memory. So there were so many things, you know, that your book made me think of.
But the localizing for you is very much about, it opens the door for that challenging of dominant narratives, or challenging of the silencing, that type of
That's the
part
thing
of it
that's
really
present for me
appealed
at the
to you.
moment, but
Yeah.
I can see, but you made me think of it so many other ways as well, yeah.
Stephanie, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to think that was really interesting. I think that local memory and social memory really very closely interlink. And you are giving an example of how this is the baseline for change and overcoming the divisions, whereas I was dealing with a case, in a specific case study, and things are also changing now in Kosovo with time, with a new generation, with new opportunities, with a change of context, thankfully. But what was really important in this specific case study was the memory of disruption of social relations that you could trust. So it was this disruption of trust. It was the policeman who you knew in your local community, from your local council, who came with his mates, even in mask, but you recognized his voice, and then he took the mask off or whatever, into the house and did the most awful things, which ended up in 6 men, the 4 sons and the husband, and other people being taken away and never to return. And the fate of most of them is officially unknown, but it is clear what happened at the same time. So, and that, the localization of these events, the local social knowledge made the memory as wounded as it was, to talk about recur. And we find that this is a Kosovo case study, one single case study, which stands for a lot though. But it also reminds me of the work of Cornelia Sorapci in Bosnia, who was looking into why people could not return to the places after they migrated, after they were driven out, why they could not return to the places where massacres happened because of the localized memory and the unbearability of it. But on the other hand, what we found then in Kosovo, on that template, we thought nobody would return. And there was this huge exodus during the NATO bombing, the Serbs' attacks increased in '99. And then people came back as quickly as they could and started to rebuild. So, you know, the outcomes can be different. But we have a message. This particular case study I looked at together with my colleague Melanie Klinkner, it's a co-authored piece, there was a clear message. So she built in her private house, she built a museum to these lost sons, the missing people, which has this huge identification potential for a lot of people in the situation, and which has a message which is becoming nationalized. So you have also, from the micro perspective of the local, the private subjective experience, you have the nationalization of this memory. It's open to school classes. People come in there, and the message is not the one that the international community wants to see. It's exactly the opposite. It's we need segregation in order to have non-repetition, for it not to happen ever again. So it's of course absolutely dramatic, because we have these huge ideas of what will bring security and peace in the long run. But then inversely, by the fact that the security guarantee is still not there, it's a frozen conflict, it's not a solved conflict, there's still skirmishes happening again and again. Human security cannot be taken for granted, so the spirit is held up and resonates. But what we tried to do in this particular chapter was, of course, a real interdisciplinary challenge, because we tried, as a social anthropologist, really, on the one hand, delving into these local meanings, to juxtapose that to these huge transitional justice ideas of dealing with the past, this principled approach. And Melanie, my co-author, she is an international law scholar. So we were looking at these big principles of, right to truth. What are they? I have to look them up. Right to truth, right to know, the right to justice, and it's the Ordentlicher principles in international soft law, following past human rights violations, to fight impunity, right to know, right to justice, right to reparation, and guarantee of non-recurrence. And then juxtaposing this to this local meaning making showed us that they were interpreted in such different ways on the local level vis-a-vis the assumptions we make in a more universalizing context. And now I'm talking in binaries, which are so problematic, but the thing is that we have to question these assumptions, these underpinning assumptions with which we operate when we talk about transitional justice, and when we want to see what that actually means and how that resonates locally, right?
Yeah, and I think that you touch on the issues which for me was sort of the second set of questions I wanted to get to. No, it's exactly right. So I think what this book does really interestingly is it makes things quite complicated. And so it says, local can be a way of challenging dominant narratives, but local, in the example you gave, could also be about wanting to protect your narrative, and that it could run counter to an international discourse that says we want reconciliation, when actually that's maybe not how people feel at a local level. It also talks about different chapters. We shouldn't romanticize the idea of the local, that there are other dynamics going on. So I wanted to really go down that road a little bit about, for you, are there challenges with the concept of the local? Is it something which also, like that sort of romanticization? I think with the so-called local turn, we can get into quite a romantic space that as long as it's local, it's good. But maybe there are other types of issues that are going on. I know, like in the Rwandan case, I think in Erin Jesse's chapter, she sort of talks about how the international community like the bones in Rwanda to be collected, and some local people, but then other local people don't want to go there because they feel like it's a contaminated place with spirits, and so there's actually like a contestation of what this means, and it sort of depends who you're talking to and who's looking at it. So I wanted to hear a little bit about the complexity of the local from your own experiences.
So so I think there's a lot of, as Stephanie put a lot of tension, first of all, between the global, local, all these different levels. But I think this whole idea of localizing is to actually go beyond the level approach, right? And see that really from a place-based approach and have this as the center of perspective. And whoever is in that center, and that can be individuals trying to make meaning, that can be communities, and the local can be different communities, and their meaning making and memories might be in tension with and to each other. So this is where it gets complicated and complex. And I think both Rwanda chapters show that quite well, and you said that already. Aaron, has a very different perspective actually on why, for example, Rwanda has chosen a strategy of exposing and displaying human remains in some of their memorials. So while she said that is a form of spiritual violence, my research has shown exactly the opposite to it. And obviously we have different localities in which we undertook that fieldwork as well, right? So this is where it becomes really complex. But the interconnectivities are there because you have, on the one hand, you have a very strong state, obviously, and you have local memories, in plural, that sit alongside that state, and some of which might contradict state narratives, some might feed into it and actually support it. So I don't want to talk about Aaron's chapter, obviously, but my research has found basically that survivors have chosen dedicate their lives to working at the memorials and to clean and care for the remains of their loved ones, to be close to them. And it's for them, and I think that's the main finding of that research, is that it's not about reconciliation to the Hutu neighbors who have killed their family members, but it's about reconciliation to the dead. So it is really about reconciling with the loved ones who could not be saved. You might have observed them dying a very, very cruel death, and you have not been able to bury them in dignity or actually prevent them from being killed. So, and that is what that makes it so important for them to give something back. So it's this sort of giving back, taken from Amarie's work on, how to reverse time and make, basically undo what has happened. And this is where the place becomes very important, and the site of the memorials, because this is where the remains are located, and this is where they can take care of them. And it comes back to mundane objects, really, right? And might be a universal strategy we see in many memorial museums inspired by Holocaust memorialization, but in Rwanda, for example, it doesn't follow any sort of script of how to memorialize the dead, but it's really about showing mundane objects and how they remind them of their dead loved ones. And this is why we find shoes there, are identity cards, a necklace, a bracelet, because people have decorated these places there. I mean, I'm not talking here about the national memorials, but really rural memorials where international visitors don't go ever. And I think that is a big difference, and it shows, really how, in different localities in the local, you can have a place-based approach that will give you different perspectives, and that's why I think localizing is so important.
So I think you also talk about it like reconnecting people, like both to the people who lost and and their communities. So it's like a reconnection issue.
Exactly.
And meaning making. Aaron, I'll come back to you, Stephan, in a sec, but let's Aaron or Claire, any thoughts on this sort of the challenge?
Yeah. So in terms of the challenge, not much like Rwanda per se, but an important context of some of the challenges in terms of the local in Liberia is that we first have to appreciate the Liberian state collapse. It was a totality of the collapse of the Liberian state, and the rebuilding process opened up the society to a massive UN peacekeeping operations, opening it up to a huge entry of international NGOs, with all of these competing actors coming to be part of the solution of rebuilding the Liberian state. There were concerns about how much of the tradition and culture, how much of the different comparative prescription for how to remember, what to remember is being compromised in terms of what has been the traditional and cultural repertoire for remembering. Further to this complexity is the population in Liberia is so stratified that you have 70% of the population are those 30 years and below, meaning you have a good part of the majority of Liberians alive today were those born during the war and after the peace agreement, whereas the older generation with the autobiographical memory of the conflict feel strongly that they are the gatekeepers to this repertoire of memory making. And you have NGOs coming with different examples of how it was done there, how it was done here, and what should be done in Liberia. So this further complicate the challenges of the local, what should be done, how it should be done, and the core group of Liberians who went through the war, who feel the traditional standards are being compromised. So there is this ongoing fight. I remember coming from the field, and I showed this very troubling picture about a particular site of massacre in a secondary school. There's a mass grave, and young kids as young as 15 were playing basketball over this site of massacre. It was a terrible scene, and so these are some of the challenges. You have young kids with very little memory of what happened, engaging with sacred spaces indifferently, very naive about what the places are, what does it mean to them. So these are some of the complexities.
That's interesting. So we've heard like the local and the global. It's like a generational difference. The other one that's in the book, a big strong theme, is the sort of individual and the collective. Is a sort of another theme. Claire, did you want to say anything?
You see, working with local communities is very challenging. There's an assumption that if you're in that community or in that family, that there's just like a ready-made collective there, but it isn't like that at all. It's, of course, so we know within even just one family there will be different people, remembering differently and have different views on how to campaign for justice or what to do. And Aaron, you're making this point. I can imagine that then in relation to the generational differences that you're talking about as well. But I just know in all the work that I've done over many years now, working with local communities, gathering interviews from different working class communities in Belfast, there's no assumption just because we're working with the group in Shankill, that everyone, from that group of Shankill Women's Centre or the ACT initiative, that they will all feel the same way. So the work is always complex. So just as complex as it is whenever you're doing it on a national scale or an official scale. So that's what I would think are the challenges of working locally. It's not easy just because it's local. It's just as complex.
Yeah.
And the more true you are to the local, the more that complexity actually emerges rather than the other way around. Yeah. So that's interesting. So I want to maybe jump to the next theme, and then I'm going to open up to... Oh, did you have a comment? Oh, sorry, Stephanie. Go ahead.
I still wanted to say something.
Yeah.
It just evoked a lot of memories, even for research. As anthropologists, we try to go backstage with the local. This is our greatest satisfaction, right? And sometimes the local is very much symbolically marked. So I remember people I worked with saying, the people with the badges, the how do you call it, what we are wearing here to get through the building, with the lanyards, they are the internationals. They will be evacuated. Those without the lanyards and not the white jeeps will have to stay and deal if conflict breaks out again. So even the post-conflict, the being in the post-conflict is about power differentials, who gets evacuated or not, and it tends to be the locals who are not evacuated and have to face the game. So it's about power is what I want to say, and you can sometimes feel that very strongly, and yet at the same time it's almost easy to deconstruct the local and say, who are we ignoring? Which voices are not only seldom heard, but which are, my colleague Mel Hugh, a social work person, says, are easily ignored. And then I think we have many layers. We don't want to essentialize and generalize who the locals are, as you say, Claire, but we have so many friction lines that we tend to ignore. For example, gender. I think we are not enough delving into gender questions and how there's a hierarchization even of victimhood when we remember. And so the local is so complex in so many ways. But I just wanted to...
No, I think it's really helpful, and actually jumps us to the last theme, which, in the introductory chapter, talks about the actions and the actors. Who are the actors in these memorial spaces? And we've touched on the international groups and local groups and others. So I wanted to hear some of your thoughts a little bit about that. There's some great phrases. I mean, different people quote them, Anita Ferreira, militants of memory, and memory activists, and then Elizabeth Helene's famous phrase of memory entrepreneurs. And in the book, what I found interesting is sometimes these phrases are used back to when you talked about the local being about activism and engagement. So memory activists who are there to maybe challenge the dominant ways of thinking or to break silences. But there's also parts of the book where memory entrepreneurs are used in an ambivalent way, where people are maybe shaping memorials in a certain way because of an international discourse. And sometimes memory entrepreneurs get things done, and that's a positive thing. So I wanted to hear a little bit about any thoughts you have about the actors in memory spaces. I know it's a big topic, but it's sort of the third theme of the book, and I'd like to maybe hear your thoughts, and then we'll turn to the audience. Was that too much? It wasn't really a specific question. It was more about when you hear actors in memory spaces and your research and your work, what comes to mind? Claire?
I suppose I did think of, people that I work with, I think of healing through remembering, for example, in terms of the activism and healing through remembering, starting off, place is, that we need to deal with the legacy of the conflict. That's the kind of starting off place. But also that everyone, the whole society needs to be involved in this. This is not just the duty or the burden or the responsibility of those most harmed. In fact, it is the responsibility of all of us. So that's the kind of ethical place, I start off with. But then whenever I think of, work that I've been involved in many years and all, it's back to what I was saying before about, the challenges of us, of people working together, to having different strategies, viewpoints. Some people not been some people been very interested in process and how to do this work ethically. And then other people sort of thinking, well, like the point here is to get to an outcome. And so that's what it makes, all of those words that you used, and I was fascinated in the book that I think one of the chapters talks about memory militance. And, you might assume whenever you heard that word militance, that was going to be destructive. But actually, the way, as I remember it's used in the chapter, is, this is around, taking strong action and provoking reaction and being in a dynamic space. That's my memory of how that was used, partially used in that way as well. So, and I suppose I just think these are useful ways for us to think about, what's going on here. And then also, this has been mentioned, from the start, who has the power to change things in all of this as well? Where does the power lie?
Yeah. Stephanie, did you want to?
Yeah, I was thinking about the term agency when you asked us for actors and memory entrepreneurs, and how claiming agency after being victimized is part of the healing process. It's part of the social and psychological transformation, of course, and that in our case study is very clear how this woman, through her memory entrepreneurship, heals herself and finds herself a new social role in society, which is part of social transformation. And later I would claim that's part of conflict transformation, and her personal healing as much as wider social healing. And yet it becomes, of course, exclusionary, because there are, I can't remember right now who said that, the memory struggles that are going on. So the moment you have several entrepreneurs vying for superiority in the narratives that count or not, and whose memories are important, it can become very hierarchizing and exclusionary again. So you have activism that then lends itself to political structure, which is again not necessarily conducive to healing and peace building. So it can be again problematic.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just points really to the dynamics, right? And every memory entrepreneur will have an agenda or a reason to engage in this kind of memory work, be it on the international level, be it on the national or different localities. So you have individuals who engage in meaning making because they mourn their loved ones, but at the same time you might have communities who want to symbolize victimhood, for example, and at the same time, blame guilt on the other groups. So they're really the dynamics. And when we talk about entrepreneurship, it's about agency, yes. And I think in terms of especially those who are most affected and harmed, so survivors of violence, it is an important and crucial step towards dealing with it and making meaning of it. I personally don't necessarily like the medicalized language of healing, because often I don't think you can really heal it, but you can manage it and you can learn to live with it. So whether we're healed and reconciled afterwards, I think, at least from my research in Rwanda, is a very big question mark over this, but we can learn to live with it. But I guess my point is just when we talk about memory entrepreneurships, that it's memory nurse that we need to bear in mind the dynamics, in terms of political structures, but also how communities work or work not with each other. So, and I think the Burundi case study, for example, is quite telling in that as well in the book.
Thank you. Aaron, did you want to add? I know from your research there are lots of different actors involved in shaping that memory space.
There are, and the litmus test I tend to use, looking at different actors, is on the one hand the duty to remember, on the other hand, how is the duty to remember being accompanied by the more existential question that memory in and of itself tend to raise, what, the why, and how much of this existential question, is committed to the preventative value that memory is supposed to inherently carry. And as you mentioned in this book, that some of these spaces are not socially, not committed to the social dialogue, and some of these spaces are not engaging with these existential questions. I think to look closely at the actors is to examine the different commitments, and how some actors are not committed to the full extent of which some of these practices should be tested and should be held to account, and how some actors are more exclusive in terms of what their notions of their own truth, which they do not hear whether it stand up to any form of scrutiny. It is more circumscribed to a smaller group than to a wider group, that it is not all for interrogation. So I think with this, for me, it's a litmus test to assess the different entrepreneurs, the contingent outcomes, that are an offshoot, of the different processes. But if there is a minimum standard, if there is a litmus test, then you can easily use that to see the different actors, the conflicting incentives, and how the outcomes vary from one to the other.
Yeah. You have to understand those dynamics.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to turn to the audience. I can see the chat that's going on with everybody online, which is a good job in multitasking, learning to read that and listen simultaneously. Of which some of the chat is also going on in Spanish, which just adds to the complexity of the local nature of this discussion, or local and global nature. So maybe I'll ask if anyone in the room has an initial question, and while you're doing that, I will just pick out one of the questions here, because there are quite a few. Does anyone have a question or comment they would like to make? Bearing in mind, we might want to give different opportunities, so keep it as brief as you can. Or being very, very shy. You don't want to be on the camera, I guess. That's probably the issue here. Well, I can jump into one of the questions. There's quite a long discussion going on. I think, Stephan, you mentioned it, that memory as a pillar of the transitional justice debate. And one of the questions that's raised, in fact, by Kath Collins, who's one of the professors at the Transitional Justice Institute, sitting in Chile, was really about I hope I'm interpreting it right, but this will be my take on it. Should it be a pillar of transitional justice? Should memory be a pillar of transitional justice? Or is it something else? How's that for a question?
It was an essay question for students, for my memory, violence, and TJ course. So
right, okay. So what was the best answer you got to that question? I give questions so that I can learn things. So.
Yeah, I found that question myself very interesting, but I shouldn't say more now on camera here.
Well, not being, in an academic or in the field of transitional justice, but, having learned over the years and, been to many seminars and learned from many colleagues. So I am interested in the whole theory and concept of transitional justice, and I was interested to know that this was the fifth pillar. I think my reaction was to think it should be. And now this may be a bit provocative to say this, but I did notice in the book that the word reconciliation was problematized quite a bit, it felt like, and that and that often it has felt to me that this is more in the political discourse about moving, out of conflict, that there is a great imperative, it feels, for many political actors to draw a line, to move on and to reconcile. That feels like, that's the goal. So it feels, and often that people doing the memory work are seen to be kind of like a barrier to that. So that's one of the themes that I picked up in the book, is almost, it was saying, this is now a pillar of transitional justice, and I thought there's something about that is given, space for this work, understanding that it is, and a very transitional justice dealing with the past is a very long-term process, is a generational process, is not something that can be just fixed, with one, process, or fixed with reconciliation, or fixed with drawing a line. So that, whenever, I read that about being the fifth pillar, I thought, I think this is a good, corrective to some of that I have noticed, but I'm talking more about the way that at the political level that this conversation sometimes goes.
So you mean memory as a way of challenging the other pillars as well, or challenging, not the other pillars, but challenging some of the dominant ideas. So it's not just, now that memory is part of transitional justice, it must push a reconciliation agenda. Actually, the fact that maybe it doesn't,
I think it
is
actually,
what its real value
that's
is.
right. It felt to me that, a lot of the, sometimes said directly, I think, in some of the chapters, that people doing this memory work are actually seen to be kind of working against reconciliation. But if we're saying that memory work is one of the pillars of transitional justice, then we have to take this seriously. This is what I felt, the book was saying. We need to take this seriously. If it is seen to be disrupting reconciliation, maybe there's something wrong with the way that we're thinking of reconciliation. Maybe this is putting a hand up and saying there's something we need to pay attention to here, that there are people experiencing ongoing injustice. So that felt, that was one of the themes that I could see in the book. Yeah. So it was the way I responded to the idea of
that's
memory
really
being the
interesting.
fifth.
I'd like others to pick up on it, and I want to just add to it, because this Maria Alice, who contacts us from Brazil, uses a very similar phrase. She says, do you see the local as a tool to deviate from some of the responsibilities set by TJ? Do you see it as a tool to deviate from some of the responsibilities? I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, but it made me think, when I saw it, it made me think a little bit of it challenging, it deviating. It's not necessarily saying we must do these 5 things, and memory is a positive thing. Memory can be a whole range of challenges and inconsistencies and ambivalences.
Yeah. So I think I'm slightly ambivalent about that, and I think we had a discussion as editors as well. Whether memory as a 5th pillar, or should memory go across pillars, and where sits memory within the TJ debate. And I mean, this is the whole background to the book, right? But I think when we think about that goes to what you said, Claire, thinking about memory as a 5th pillar, then on the one hand we have elevated memory to the same level as justice, and that might be legal justice, which is good. But at the same time, it comes with the standardization of memory, as we can observe in all other pillars, right? So then we suddenly have the toolkit. We have a memory toolkit, and we see this already. We build a memorial museum. It follows a specific standard, and we basically deploy memory, and then we harness reconciliation from it. And I think the localizing perspective shows that this is not how memory works. Memory is not an outcome, and you mentioned that earlier as well, Claire, but it's a process, and it's a long-term process. It's a changing process, and it will change according to what memory entrepreneurs are involved. It will change with generations, right? And who have who has a specific understanding of that memory, where they're coming from, etc. So I think this is why I'm slightly cautious about memory as a fifth pillar, unless we can really avoid this whole TJ toolkit and specific language of reconciliation. And as I said, like my research has shown that it's not about reconciling with perpetrators. And yes, that is the government narrative. We have those memorials in order to incite somehow critical thinking and have reconciliation at the end. But how this really works, we actually don't know. It's just the typical TJ language, and I think there I would be very careful without, at the same time, again, romanticizing the local. And I think this is why maybe there are no answers, but we just need to keep questioning.
Well, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because it's like the localizing should be an antidote to the standardization. But if you accept the standardization, there's a risk that it becomes overly standardized or normalized. Normalization, prescriptive. I know, put you on the spot, Aaron, just because I know your research, but I know you spoke to us about examples, I think, in Liberia of that standardization, of the UN's approach to memorials. That just came to mind when Julia was talking.
Yeah, so the UN is coming up in Liberia as an actor. As part of what you described in your work as an actor. So in Liberia and the rise of the UN is operating in a context where there is low political will to move ahead with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So the UN pushing for the design and implementation of static monument and is being received with a lot of mixed reactions. Because on the one hand, the rise of these memorials in different parts of the country is not committed to the dialogue that memorials everywhere are meant to have. The UN is not engaged with that. It's like trying to fulfill a checklist of what the TRC recommended. So the UN is doing that. Secondly, others reviewing the UN's work and maybe thinking about the whole responsibility to protect. Is our new interpretation in the use of memorial? Is the UN trying to reinterpret the responsibility to protect in how Truth Commission recommendation ought to be implemented? So these questions have been raised. The second point I wanted to raise on this, on the wider question of now memorialization as a fifth pillar, is the twist with the AU Transitional Justice Policy Framework. In the AU Transitional Justice Policy Framework, memorialization has received quite a lot of visibility. The only issue with that is that this framework was launched on the eve of COVID. So we are still, some countries like Sierra Leone and other parts of the continent are now trying to domesticate this framework. So it hasn't been operationalized so that people can see, but it will be of great interest to see. We're not praying for peace agreements, because peace agreements mean more conflict. But it would be good to see the future of TJ in Africa, and how this policy framework is going to influence the outcome of all future peace agreement, where memorialization is a big part of the menu that is being offered in this framework. So the UNDP and operations in Liberia and supporting the rise of these very static memorial that is not raising the existential questions that are supposed to be a part of how memorials are designed and how they contribute to ongoing social dialogue. Is not part of it. And then the AU, I think the AU made a determination on the memorialization as a fifth pillar long before the UN made that determination. Yeah.
Any other questions? I have some more here. I can turn to those if you're all still too shy. Okay. Chris. Maybe say you are, Chris.
Chris Brown, University of Ulster University, rather. It's a question for Claire mainly, but I invite responses from any other member of the panel. Claire, I've always been struck by the depth, the richness, the powerful context and human emotions that emerges from oral history, which you're being long involved in. But we're also talking about memorials here, memorial spaces, often very powerful sites, but even if they're quite symbolically rich, they lack context. They lack often the human connection as well, even if they may use powerful imagery sometimes. Can you think of any way which oral history might help to enrich those memorial spaces? And invite responses from anybody else in the panel too.
Well, I'm picking up, you see, from Aaron that, you know, in terms of the TJ, transitional justice context, in terms of making this a fifth pillar, there is meant to be this dynamic, you know, space, and you're talking about, them being kind of fixed and going back to that notion, I think, earlier, or, you know, when the memorials become more insular or all of that, and become either that or become contested. So in all of that, I suppose, I do go back to, you know, another thing that I picked up from the book, which was that in order to make the work of memory to have that dynamic potential in it, to have that some of that restorative maybe potential in it, that there also needs to be a wider context in which people can understand their memories and what happened. And so, I mean, that brings me back to the truth recovery, in a sense, project, and that whenever that is incomplete, hasn't been done sufficiently, and I'm not trying to say, because there's been so many critiques of, you know, a Truth Commission can do this, but whenever there has been the absence of, you know, our truth recovery is being shut down, then it feels to me that then also damages all the other things that are supposed to happen in transitional justice as well, including, you know, memorialisation and, you know, memories and all of that. So it's back to, I do remember a number of years ago at Healing Through Remembering, a number of us involved in storytelling and narrative work invited Kevin Whelan to give us a talk, and he talked about educating memory, and, you know, and I think there's a reference to that in the book as well. So how to release the potential of memory. So that's what I think you're talking about, Chris. I can see that. Some of that I can see in the work that I do at a very small scale level with the oral histories. I can see both. I can see the feelings of it. You know, I can see the limitations, rather, maybe I should say, of it. But also sometimes I can see the potential of it. And one of the things, for example, we do in small group work is take. You remember I said we start interviews with where and when were you born? So we've made cards from, you know, some of the oral history narratives, and the first section of the interview, just that answer to that first question we have on a card, where and when you born? You know, my name is Claire Hackett, I was born in 1959, rural part, you know, County Tyrone. Another wee bit, you know, I had so many people in my family. So we put that down, and then people choose a card, and they then I tell them another story connected to that. So there's some, so they don't choose the connecting story of the, you know, some of the defining points of somebody's life or the things that have harmed them. They choose, you know, the where and when were you born part. And this might be not a story that they would have chosen unless there was this more gentle entry point to it. I don't know if I've made that clear. So it's a way of finding out about other people's experiences of the conflict and trying to get beyond, you know, our notions of these were the, you know, these were the cracks, you know, in our conflict, and, you know, these are the people who suffered in the same way as I did, and these are the people who suffered in a different way. So it's trying to sort of disrupt some of that overall unfinished kind of business of understanding conflict, I think, and get underneath it. So in answer to your question, Chris, I think we can be doing more with memorials, but I do understand the reason, very much understand the reason why we have them to the extent that we have, and I see in all the other contexts that we are talking about, And it feels to me that's part of the unfinished work of delivering, truth to people, as much justice as there can be, information, doing that work of interpretation. So, but even, in our own and I know commemoration here is, very contested and seen to be very problematic. And I still just think like it occupies the space because there is other work not being done. So that's a very long-winded answer, sorry. So I'm not sure. It's probably the very short answer to that.
I think that's really, really helpful, Claire. We promised this would go on for an hour and a half, so unbelievably, we've been busy for an hour and a half. So I could certainly be quite happy to keep going, but I think we need to start wrapping up. So I thought what I might do by way of wrapping up is just give you a flavour of some of the questions that are on the online, and then give you each, minute or two to maybe make some closing comments as a way of rounding off the discussion. Does that sound okay? So I won't read the questions in full, but they have a sort of common theme to them. So Kath Collins in Chile, what do we do when memory is aimed at or used for incitation or inciting violence rather than preventing violence? What do we do? And then quite a similar question from Brenda O'Neill. How do we think post-conflict generations can do memory work while avoiding the idea that local memory practices simply protect a particular narrative? So how do we do memory work in that space? And then perhaps a really challenging question, and it's not really the focus of the book, because the book in a sense is focused on societies moving out of conflict, but a question from Rosa Borras. She's in Mexico, and she's essentially saying, well, where does this fit when we're talking about ongoing violence and the violence that's been going on in her society since 2006, and also then talks about that's now sort of morphed into organized crime, and then you can't really locate specific groups that this, the actors are in memory. I'm interpreting her question a little bit. Yeah, and then she adds, and there's not even any really real recognition that this is a conflict in some ways. So I suppose people are asking really hard questions. How do we deal with violence? How do we deal with ongoing context? Where does memory fit into that? I don't expect you to have the answers to that, but I wanted you at least to have the flavor of the discussion that I'm privy to here, which is actually really nice to see that going on at the same time. So I don't think we're necessarily going to resolve it, but there's lots of food for thought, and I might just give you each a minute or two to maybe wrap up with some concluding thoughts about localizing memory and the challenges, or maybe something you're taking away from the discussion, or if there's an attempt to answer some of these questions. You're looking that way, but I'm looking at you. We'll go like that, because Claire finished last, so we'll...
Yeah, I think, I enjoy reading. To just end on this note, it was a very timely, it's a very updated work on memory. You do a very good survey of the field, and especially given visibility to the UN stands on making memorialization as a fifth pillar, and then circling back on the conversation of the local, which is always very contested as much as memory is contested. The local in anthropological terms is very difficult, and I was just having a conversation with Brandon, reading his own interpretation or his own definition of what the local is. That was really an interesting spin to it. But my final remark on this, and this is in direct response to the question about what do we do with when memorials start to incite violence. My reaction to the question would be, what is the violence targeted at, or what do we do if memorial is inciting conflict? What is this? Memorials. Some memorials are allocanto memory, trying to shoot down a hegemonic memory, or some memorials in a very local context, and are actually very horizontal conflict that we see running against each other. So these But I think the way to deal with that, is to keep the space open for dialogue. And there has to be a space where contradicting narrative coexist and feed off each other. In my own modest response, that would be the way I respond to that. But thanks for having me. Yeah.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I think the discussion really has shown that localizing memory is important, and it's even more important to better understand it. And the book is just, I think, a beginning of a dialogue and conversation about how we can think about localizing memory in transitional justice contexts with and without using the TJ toolkit and TJ language, and perhaps thinking of localizing as something really place-bound without, putting all this TJ discourse around it, but leave it as it is and trying to really understand it from the locality itself. And I think that is something that we really in the whole TJ debate not very good in doing, actually. And I think that is what this book wanted to show, and I hope has shown, that we need to keep the conversation open, and that we need to have a nuanced and balanced view on things, and there's no one-fit-all approach. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm happy to follow on from that, because one core point is that the book and also what we hear here as questions allows us to compare, and we can learn so much from comparison. And particularly being here in Belfast and listening to you, Claire, and people around us, it makes me think so much about where we are in the specific case study I studied or tried to understand a bit of in Kosovo, and thinking of how generational change matters, how context matters, the security, but also geopolitical factors. Where is power? Where is support for different factions, or for the peace process, or for how is the particular country case study closed up or opened up? In Kosovo, we still have a problem with, they're in the middle of Europe, but they can't really travel freely, and are excluded from so much. And that generates, when you have this closeness and at the same time still a non-recognition, which also in the wider geopolitical field has to do with Russia's support for the Serbs. Yeah, so you can't isolate that from these wider contexts. How can we expect people to reconcile? And then, this moralizing discourse of reconciliation is just being rejected because it would be a liability at the stage where you don't have a predictability of security long term. So human security is so important, and I think we need really to look at the specific context and time and space, and that includes wider geopolitical situations. And also, we had this discussion before, audiences. Who is looking, who is listening to these conversations that are being had, and how do they change conversations? So I think I'll leave it with this. I think it's an open discussion.
Thank you. That's great.
I suppose all I want to say is really, yes, those questions are very complex that you ended with, and we had some great questions. And to me, the book raises these questions and starts to answer them. So I really do recommend the book, because it raises so many of these questions, but also anchors them in particular places. And, I really enjoyed the case study approach to it, which made it real as well. So it's theory and reality as well.
Great. Well, thank you. I saw the editors looking very happy that you recommended the book. I would recommend the book too. I don't know, before I close off, I want to say a few words. If Mina, Stephan, Julia, if there's anything you would like to add before I maybe officially close proceedings.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for this discussion, for all these very interesting insights. I think what I want to finish with is kind of an opening in relation to the question on oral histories, which I found really very interesting. And this idea of identities versus experience. I mean, I kind of interpreted it as that. This idea that experiences can be found through many different groups, right? You can have shared experiences. But when it's about identities, that's when it's very difficult also to find experiences that can be perceived as shared. So oral histories for me, from what I've observed until now, can be a way to actually transcend this and give individual voices the possibility to create something common. But it has to be, of course, done in a certain way, with a certain objective.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks to the panel and to Brandon in particular for bringing us together here this afternoon. And of course to all of you who have thought along and asked questions. I was just intrigued by this concept of educated memory that was raised. I think it was you, Claire. Well, this coming from someone who's locally anchored, but not only that, but someone who has seen the cleavages that also arise out of different kinds of memories that may be contrasting and conflicting and antagonistic in the long run. And I just wanted to link this to another debate, which is, of course, coming up very, very soon, has been around for a while, the decolonization debate. So I come from a country which is full of statues of King Leopold. And you can imagine this raises all kinds of issues for autochthonous and new Belgians, and for diaspora communities, and for peoples living in the countries in Central Africa where that reign was very much alive. So the debate is all about, let's say, withdrawing from public space statues of that nature. And so a counter debate says, well, no, let's keep the statues, but create a counter narrative, a counter memory. So just across the street of one of the statues in central Brussels is now a square called Lumumba Square. And you obviously see the symbolism. Or others argue, well, put next to this statue of King Leopold another statue of Congolese, or something more positive, or something that relates to liberation and emancipation. I think that debate is really interesting because it also shows that it's not enough just to revive memories. It also depends on what kind of memories they are and how they relate to the current strands in society, whether they actually are retrospective or prospective, whether they link people or they divide people. And so that idea, I think, merits further attention. And maybe through the lens of the debate on decolonization, it could also be enriched in some way. So thank you so much again for these wonderful ideas and discussions. And we hope to continue the discussion. And maybe, who knows, maybe it may lead to a next book.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much, Stephan, Mina, and to our panel for some really fascinating comments. I was at a conference with Stephan and sort of as a throwaway line said, you should launch the book in Belfast. And I'm really so glad you took the opportunity to do that. And the discussion's been so rich and it will continue over the rest of your visit. So thanks very much for coming out here and for everybody on the panel. There were a number of people asking how do they order the book. So for those in the room, there's some flyers. For those of you who joined online, actually in the invitation you were sent, there's actually a link to the book page itself. This session's been recorded, so it'll be available on the Transitional Justice Institute's YouTube channel, so if you want to spread the word. From my side, I just want to thank the Transitional Justice Institute who supported this, particularly to thank Rory O'Connell, who's been helping out a huge amount in making sure this would happen, including when I was away. So thanks, Rory, and also to Alison Gordon, who assists us, who did a really fantastic job. So thanks, everybody, for coming. For those of you who are here, we have some drinks outside. Sorry, for those of you who are online, you're on your own, wherever you might be. But good luck. Maybe you'll find somewhere local to have a drink. But we do appreciate you joining us online. It's been great, and to do this sort of two-way process. So please join us for a drink. And I don't know what the official thing's meant to be, but I hereby officially launch this book. And enjoy reading it. Fascinating work, and thanks, everybody. So good evening.